Welcome to Exploration and Analysis. Today's topic is the 1996 presidential election, and this is part of our presidential election series, which started with the 1992 presidential election. And I do recommend seeing that video first, as this is kind of a sequel to that video, picking up with a lot of the same themes that we covered on that video. And in the interest of time, I'd rather not repeat some of the things that I had stated in that video, but I will be referencing a lot because a lot of the themes from that video do carry over into this election. So where we left off with the 1992 election, of course, was Bill Clinton winning, ascending into the presidency, and he had a kind of roller coaster ride of a first term, and we'll be talking about that quite a bit as it goes into the election itself. We'll be looking at the 1994 midterms as well as the Republican primaries, where they would nominate their candidate and then go on to the general election. So as Clinton began his presidency, he had some goodwill, and we typically call this the honeymoon period of a lot of presidents will experience this. People wanted him to succeed. He was elected during a pretty bad economic downturn. Technically, the economy was in recovery by 1993, but the recovery was sluggish and uneven. Different parts of the country were experiencing better economic circumstances, while others were still struggling quite a bit. So Clinton had made a lot of promises during his campaign in 1992, and some of those promises, while appealing to certain key constituencies in Clinton's coalition, were not broadly popular, while other priorities were indeed very popular. So there were two ways of prioritizing. One way says that there's no second chance to make a first impression. So you want to kick off while you have this goodwill by doing some things that are popular, as people's eyes will be on you, and you want to reinforce that goodwill that they have. The other idea is if you're going to have to do some unpopular things, get those out of the way early. So the 1996 election will happen eventually, and Clinton will want to run for re-election. So if he does those unpopular things the furthest away from that election date, the thought being perhaps that would be better to get him over with early, and then hopefully by the election people will have forgotten or at least forgiven. So I think that there's two schools of thought, and it does seem as though Bill Clinton will lean more towards the latter. One of the first things he does is an executive order allowing gays to serve in the military. Now, if you're not aware of this, in the early 90s, the politics of gay rights was very different from what they are now. The country was much more conservative, and the military was a lot more conservative than it is now, I would say. The military was seen as a very conservative institution, and Bill Clinton wasn't necessarily well liked in the military because he had avoided the Vietnam draft, and a lot of folks within the veteran community distrusted him because of that. So the other thing too about executive orders is you don't need congressional approval. You can just do them as president, and it can be quick. So he decided to do this as one of his first things to do. An unpopular policy, get it out of the way early, and it's something he can do without having a long drawn out congressional debate about this. But it would end up souring that honeymoon a little bit, as a lot of the American people broadly, but particular within certain circles, would definitely oppose this policy. Clinton would also propose a stimulus package, and this would be a spending program on infrastructure and a few other projects. And it was something that Bill Clinton had promised, and something that he had talked a lot about during the primary season when they were trying to brainstorm about how to get the economy back in good form again. So he talked about doing this stimulus package, and he attempted to do it, but the Senate had filibustered the stimulus package, and it did not end up passing and becoming law. So it was a little bit of a black mark that he had this legislative failure so early on something that he had talked quite a bit about during his campaign. So this legislative defeat got Clinton off to a fairly shaky start, along with the gay marriage issue. Now, the gay marriage issue, I should say, he passed the executive order, which at the time executive orders were not done so willy-nilly as they are now, but he did that. But because of the backlash, he ended up doing a compromise with gays in the military called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where the ban would be lifted so long as they did not advertise that they would be that they were gay, that they would still be allowed to serve in the military. So it was kind of a middle ground between the outright legalization of gays in the military that he had promised and the complete ban that had happened before he was president. But the big issue in 1993 would be this budget bill. So much like Bush before him, Clinton would decide to raise taxes in order to deal with the budget deficit. So he indefinitely postponed what his middle class tax cut that he had talked about as a presidential candidate and decided instead to have a tax increase. So that tax increase would include a tax on wealthier income earners, which he did say in his campaign that he would do that. But in this budget that he proposed, that tax increase for the wealthy included people who were not as wealthy as the people he said he would tax during his campaign. It also included a gasoline tax, which everybody who bought gas would pay for, and he did not campaign on that. Ross Perot and Paul Tsongas had proposed those things in the campaign, and he had said that he opposed those ideas, but then once he became president, he did flip-flop on the gas tax. So originally it wasn't a gas tax, it was an energy tax that he presented to Congress, but during the course of the congressional debate, they changed it to a gas tax. So that's what would end up happening, and it would pass, but it would pass with only Democratic votes. Democrats did have a majority in the Congress, but that included a lot of congressional members who represented districts that had been voting Republican. Certainly a lot that had voted for Reagan, for Bush in his first time, and even some that had voted for Bush the second time. So they were members of Congress representing districts, or in the case of senators, entire states that had voted Republican for the last 4 presidential elections. And he was asking them to now vote for this tax increase. And that tax increase was very unpopular in the country, and the Republicans certainly took a hard stand against it. The other big issue in 1993 would be NAFTA. So in the campaign, Clinton had said that he would renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement and come up with a treaty that addressed the concerns of environmental groups and unions. So he said he supported NAFTA in concept, but didn't support the version of NAFTA that Bush had negotiated. He wanted to renegotiate it, addressing some of these concerns that the more liberal constituencies had raised about it. But he quickly changed his mind after winning the presidency and would flip-flop on this and then come out and strong support of NAFTA, to the point of, again, trying to win over a lot of Democrats in Congress who were on the fence about it. Now, at this point in time, it's going to be more Democrats being against NAFTA in Congress and more Republicans being for it than the other way around. For example, the House Majority Leader and House Majority Whip, Dick Gephardt and David Bonner, respectively, were both representing highly unionized congressional districts, and they were very much against NAFTA because it was thought that by opening up free trade, it would undermine the workers that were working in industrial jobs. So a lot of Democrats in those more Rust Belt kind of areas tended to be the ones in strongest opposition to NAFTA. So it would end up passing, but it would pass with more Republicans voting for it. And some moderate Democrats did vote for it as well, and some of those had to be persuaded by Bill Clinton in some way, shape, or form to get with the yes vote for NAFTA, even though they had some misgivings about it. So NAFTA was not broadly popular amongst the American people. A lot of organized labor were against it. It was seen as something that more the corporations were in favor of. It was seen as something that the business community favored, but the concerns about what it would do to labor and were very much widespread throughout a lot of the country. So it passed, which was a legislative victory, but it wasn't something particularly popular amongst the general public. In the year after presidential elections happen, there are local elections in Virginia, New Jersey, and the local elections in New York, including New York City. Now, I remember this happening during Joe Biden's presidency, where Republicans were very happy because they won the Virginia governorship. They came close in New Jersey, so they considered that a big victory, and they thought that they would then do well in the congressional elections the next year. But I think back to 1993, and compared to the 2021 local elections, 1993 elections were much more favorable to Republicans. So we see George Allen being the candidate the Republicans nominated for governor in Virginia, absolutely trouncing his Democratic opponent, Mary Sue Kelly, 58% by 42%. So Republicans would love to be winning elections in Virginia now by that kind of margin. So in 1993, they were blowing away Democrats in Virginia, and then in New Jersey, it wasn't losing by a small amount; it was winning by a small amount. We see Christine Todd Whitman defeating incumbent James Florio, 49% to 48%. And the big issue in that campaign was a tax increase. Florio had said he wouldn't raise taxes, then he did, then he loses the reelection attempt. So perhaps Republicans at least hoped that that would be a foreshadowing for things to come in the presidential election. So New Jersey, again, a state where Republicans would love to be winning statewide races there nowadays. Here in 1993, they were indeed winning, and they weren't only winning in New Jersey and Virginia, they were winning in New York City. So also here we see incumbent David Dinkins running for re-election. He's a Democrat. He's going to lose to the Republican Rudolph Giuliani. So we see a Republican winning citywide in New York for the mayorship, 51% to 48%. So this would be a very good results for the Republicans indeed. So there's going to start to be speculation about who the Republicans might nominate for president in 1996, and that's going to start all the way in 1993. So let's talk about some of these people. Let's start with Jack Kemp, certainly a media darling at the time. You know, he was very well liked, very good on television. He had been a football player, and he had been in Congress representing Buffalo, a sort of purplish blue area on Lake Erie, and also on Lake Erie is kind of northern Ohio, and Detroit, well considered battleground states. So he had a way of he supported supply side economics, a very pro business agenda, but he had a way of appealing to middle America that not all supply siders had. So it was thought that he might be able to package the Republican agenda in a way that could be more broadly appealing, and maybe take away some of the sharper edges and have a more kind of a softer, sort of kinder, gentler way of framing those issues. So he had also been Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Bush, and he had run for president in 1988, and was seen as being a very impressive potential candidate. So a lot of the media thought he was the front runner, going into 1993. But there were also a couple of governors that were very popular, very much on the rise, representing purplish blue states. One was Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin, and he, was fairly conservative. He had put forth a welfare reform package in Wisconsin that was seen as rather innovative. And, so he was somebody who was on the rise, and his stature was certainly rising, and he was seen as somebody who could potentially appeal to blue collar voters and Reagan Democrats. The other person like that was John Angler, who was the governor of Michigan. Again, a fairly conservative governor representing a purplish blue state, but able to, again, be something of like Tommy Thompson and maybe Jack Kemp, all kind of Reagan Democrat whisperers, so to speak, able to appeal to, voters who might not be traditional Republicans. So they were all talked about as potential candidates. Now, the other person pictured there is Phil Gramm. I'm going to talk a little bit more about him later, but he certainly was somebody who was trying to, raise his profile. He was making a lot of media appearances, and I think he was the least shy about his desire to be a Republican presidential candidate. Also, as far as governors go, we have two others that represented, in the case of Pete Wilson, maybe a purplish blue state. California had been a very Republican state earlier in the century, but it was becoming more purple or even blue as we get into the 90s. But Pete Wilson had been elected senator there, and he now was the governor of the the state. So he was certainly somebody who was talked about, and he was trying to tackle the immigration issue. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But also pictured there is William Weld, who represented Massachusetts. His stature and his profile was on the rise as well, and he was talked about as a potential candidate, maybe somebody that could appeal to those more Rockefeller Republicans and Northeastern moderates. And then we have, of course, Dan Quayle, the socially conservative former vice president, who now was a former vice president, but he had been under Bush. And anytime you have a recent vice president, he's got to be somebody in the conversation about seeking the nomination for the presidency the next time. Gun control would also be a big issue during this time. So in 1993, Bill Clinton would get behind and Congress would pass something called the Brady Bill. And this would impose a waiting period before a person could buy a gun. And during that waiting period, a background check would occur. So also that as part of the 1994 crime bill, there would be another gun control provision in that, which would ban what they called assault weapons or semi-automatic weapons. So while polls showed that these gun control measures were fairly popular amongst the American people, there was a segment of the population that very much opposed these kinds of gun control measures. And the NRA, the National Rifle Association, was an organization that was very influential politically during this time. They donated a lot of money to candidates. And for those candidates that, shall we say, represented more Republican areas that were voting for the Brady Bill and then later the assault weapons ban, the NRA would target those members and try to defeat them because they had a lot of influence and a lot of money behind them. Bill Clinton had made health insurance reform a major part of his 1992 campaign, but in order to make it come to fruition, he had to get it past Congress. And he tapped his wife Hillary to come up with a plan that the administration would get behind. Many in Congress took issue with how Hillary operated, and often she would work behind closed doors to work out some of the details, and a lot of people in Congress thought that they were kind of shut out by her approach and that they weren't getting enough input. So there were competing proposals out there from different members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, but mostly Democrats, that had different ideas that varied a little bit from what the Clintons had in mind. So there really wasn't a consensus among the Democrats on how to do healthcare reform. So it was something that Clinton attempted, but somewhere along the way it got bogged down. And it didn't end up passing because the Democrats couldn't unite behind one particular proposal, and there just wasn't enough support. Clinton had managed to twist enough arms to kind of pass some of the measures that we talked about earlier, but he wasn't able to, continue to twist those arms as enough Democrats were starting to get nervous about their reelection. They had voted for a lot of these unpopular measures, and polls were starting to see them, facing potential defeat. So he was unable to get his healthcare reform package past Congress, something that he had talked a lot about during his campaign. There would be a fair amount of drama amongst Clinton's cabinet during his first term, so the cabinet would certainly face its share of scrutiny. So there was a high turnover with varying degrees of scandal. Agricultural Secretary Mike Espy was scrutinized for accepting gifts that were considered inappropriate. Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary faced scrutiny for lavish travel expenses. HUD, Housing Urban Development Secretary Henry Cisneros, and Transportation Secretary Ron Brown also faced scrutiny and left the cabinet in 1994. So it's never a good sign for a president when he's got this much scandal and turnover amongst his top advisors and his cabinet members. So Clinton himself would also be involved in some scandals during this early part of his first term. So in the 1992 election, there had been a number of scandals involving him, and these scandals would start to add up during the early part of his presidency. One such scandal was called Travelgate, and it involved Bill and Hillary Clinton basically replacing the longtime White House travel staff with their own supporters and loyalists. It was seen as a type of cronyism, and Bill Clinton was seen by some as being somewhat corrupt by replacing these government workers with his own sort of lackeys, so to speak. Another incident had happened on an airplane, a rather embarrassing one, where he received a $200 haircut from a hairstylist named Christophe, And it was said at the time that the haircut was causing a delay at the entire that airplanes couldn't come in or come out. That part was later debunked, but nevertheless, it was an embarrassing episode. If you're trying to appeal to middle America, if you're getting a $200 haircut by a guy named Christoph, it's just not a good look. And Bill Clinton did come from humble origins, but a lot of people in America had thought that maybe he had sold out or kind of gone Hollywood. And I think that this scandal kind of touched on that sort of a concern that a lot of people had had. But perhaps maybe the bigger scandal involved an accusation of sexual harassment by an Arkansas government worker named Paula Jones. He was the governor of the state at the time, and she was a government worker. And she accused him of trying to solicit sex and trying to use his authority as basically her boss at the time to try to get sexual favors, for him. And sexual harassment had been an issue that had was fairly new on the scene, but it was starting to rise in people's awareness and attention. And it had been liberals and Democrats who had been the one raising attention about the issue. Earlier, we had seen two high-profile Republicans accused of sexual harassment, and Clarence Thomas, who had become the Supreme Court justice, and a senator named Bob Packwood had resigned over the issue. So it had been two Republicans so far who had the most high-profile accusations, but now it was a Democrat's turn to face accusations of sexual harassment. So it was something that a lot of Republicans have raised the issue of, well, all these liberals were going on about how important sexual harassment is, but now when a Democrat is accused of it, they weren't nearly as vocal about their concerns as they had been when a Republican had been accused of it. Another big piece of legislation that would pass during 1994 is the crime bill. And I think the crime bill is an example of something that really doesn't happen anymore, a real consensus legislation in that there was probably nobody that agreed with everything in this crime bill, but there was something in the bill that probably appealed to everybody across the political spectrum. So what did it entail? So in the crime bill, there would be increases in sentences for violent offenders, a famous 3 strikes and you're out. So after 3 convictions of violent crime, a person would be in jail for life. So there was money in the bill for building new prisons. There was money for putting more cops on the beat. So these tough on crime measures were definitely things that would have appealed to conservatives, but there were also things that could appeal to the liberals. There was money spent for crime prevention programs, community-based programs that were geared towards youths, programs that would keep youths from doing crime and instead directing them towards more constructive things. And these spending measures were things that conservatives didn't like, but what liberals did like. So there was a mixed bag. Those who supported it, included a lot of moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats, but the people who didn't like it included people on the left who thought that the anti-crime measures were too draconian, and conservatives didn't like it because they didn't like the spending measures on some of the social programs. Bill Clinton did not get to do welfare reform in his first 2 years. Now, that was something that he did promise in his campaign and something that a lot of Americans wanted him to do, but it wasn't something that he was able to find time for. The other thing that he did not address was the Rwandan genocide. Now, this is, a tragedy that it is said that over 800,000 people died in Rwanda as a result of this genocide. And Bill Clinton looks back and says that his biggest regret was not trying to do something as president to try to stop that from happening. So let's talk about the 1994 congressional campaign. Democrats had controlled the House since the 1950s, and it was still thought that they would prevail in 1994 despite the dropping popularity of Democrats and Bill Clinton as the year went on. Now, the Republicans would have a leadership change. They had been led by Bob Michel, who had been a more moderate Republican who had friends amongst the Democrats. But the next in line would have been Newt Gingrich, a congressman from Georgia, who at this point was the whip in the House, but he would be the next in line to be in charge after Bob Michael were to step down. And Gingrich was considered more partisan. He had led attacks on a prior speaker, Jim Wright, a Democrat, and a lot of Democrats had, disliked Gingrich after that episode. So he would nationalize the congressional campaign with something called the Contract of America. And what the Contract with America was a set of promises that he enacted that if the Republicans were to win, these would be a list of measures that they would try to enact once they took control. So this had never really been done in a congressional campaign before, where the entire delegation had a set of promises that they all kind of agreed, or most of them at least agreed to, a sort of national agenda. So it was kind of a new idea, and it included a wide array of different things from kind of procedural measures that probably the average person didn't really think much about. Like there were limits on how long a committee chair could serve. There was now going to be a ban on proxy voting. So there were measures like that. There were also things like a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, an amendment that would have term limits on members of Congress. So there were items like that, and a line item veto. So if there was a bill that included a wide array of different things in it that Congress passed, the president would be able to veto certain parts of that bill without necessarily vetoing the whole thing. So it was kind of a new idea that had originally came about when Republicans controlled the presidency and the Democrats controlled the Congress, but now it was something that they were going to enact if Republicans took control of the Congress now with a Democratic president. So there were actual policy differences on issues like welfare reform, tort reform, and there was a tax cut as part of the promises in the Contract with America. So Republicans would indeed end up winning the congressional midterm elections this year and winning by a pretty big landslide to the surprise of many observers. So let's start by talking about the House. The Republicans would win that generic ballot. So if we look across the country, 7% more Americans voted for Republicans that year than Democrats. So that would be a gain of 54 seats. Now, a lot of these seats included some more conservative districts. For example, in the South, there were 19 Southern seats that switched. So these had been some of the seats I talked about in that last video that had been pretty conservative. They had been voting for Republicans in the 80s and 90s in presidential elections, but sending Democrats to the House. Now they're kind of realigning. Now the voters are voting consistently for Republicans in the Congress as well as they had been in the presidency as well. So 34 Democratic incumbents would lose, including some pretty important, powerful ones. Speaker Tom Foley, who, it's very rare that you would see a speaker lose his seat. Well, in 1994, you did indeed see that happen. So Tom Foley had represented a district in eastern Washington State, the area around Spokane, and he would end up losing. You'd also see Chicago's Dan Rostenkowski, a very powerful chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. He had been involved in something of a scandal, was under investigation. He would end up losing his seat. So no Republicans lost any congressional seats that year. So it's rare that you just see one party seeing incumbents lose, whereas no Republican incumbents lost. So it went from a 258 to 176 Democratic majority to a 230 to 204 Republican majority, a pretty big swing. We'd also see a big swing in the Senate. Republicans are going to pick up 8 seats. And after the election is over, shortly thereafter, we're going to see 2 Democrats in the Senate switch parties. So it's going to go from a 56 to 44 Democratic majority to a 54 to 46 Republican majority. So we see again the 8 seat swing plus 2 when those 2 Democrats. Those would be Richard Shelby in Alabama and Ben Nighthorse Campbell in Colorado went from being Democrat to Republican just shortly after the election. And we would also see Republicans do well in gubernatorial elections. So they would pick up 10 seats amongst the various governor races. And those states would include New York and Texas, 2 of the biggest states in the country. And we'd see all of these potential Republican presidential candidates winning re-election, including William Weld, Pete Wilson, Tommy Thompson, and John Engler. There was a little bit of talk about maybe there might be a primary challenger amongst the Democrats. Certainly after that big loss in the congressional election, Bill Clinton's popularity was declining, and it wasn't unusual that a member of the president's party might challenge him when the president is unpopular. We had seen it happen in 1976 when Ronald Reagan challenged Gerald Ford. Then we saw Ted Kennedy challenge Jimmy Carter. We saw Pat Buchanan challenge George H.W. Bush in 1992. So in each of those examples, it was somebody who maybe represented the party's base a little bit more. In the case of the Republicans, somebody who was a little bit more to the right of the incumbent president was. And in the case of Ted Kennedy, it was to the left of Jimmy Carter. So amongst these different people here, we see Jesse Jackson would have fit that mold as being somebody who was to the left of Bill Clinton. Paul Wellstone might have also fit that category. But the thing is that the left really wasn't too dissatisfied or too angry with Bill Clinton at this point, because if you look at some of those things that made him less popular, they tended to be things that upset people on the right more than people on the left. The exceptions might have been NAFTA, where people on the left tended to not like NAFTA, and certainly both Jackson and Wellstone were against NAFTA. So was Dick Gephardt, who's also pictured here, and he had run in 1988. Then also pictured here was Bill Bradley, a very well-regarded, sort of a Rhodes Scholar, a member of the Senate, and Bob Kerrey, who had been a candidate in 1992. But probably the person who was most talked about as challenging Bill Clinton was Bob Casey, who was the governor of Pennsylvania. Now, Casey had been to the right of Bill Clinton, certainly on social issues. He had been anti-abortion. So he, was said to have taken some steps to possibly run, but then had some health problems. So it wouldn't end up happening that anybody would challenge Bill Clinton from the Democratic side, but there was certainly talk at this point that that could happen. With that midterm election defeat, Clinton was certainly down, but not out. He used this period to regroup and try to reinvent himself, reintroduce himself to the American people. And he had a chance to do that because with Gingrich's profile on the rise, he now had somebody that he could use as a foil, somebody to contrast himself with, somebody to say to voters, hey, you may not like me that much, but you like me better than this guy. And Gingrich had, not necessarily sold himself to the American people, but in his mind, he kind of did, because he thought that by winning such a big margin, by gaining so many seats, that voters were voting for him and his ideas and his policies. Maybe that was true to a point, but I think that he overthought his own value in the minds of the American public, and Clinton used that to his advantage to kind of turn things around and turn Gingrich into something of a villain. Bill Clinton got a new advisor at this time, a gentleman named Dick Morris, who helped him kind of shape his message a little bit more. Morris would advocate for a concept called triangulation, where Bill Clinton would distinguish himself not only from the Republicans in Congress, but from the Democrats as well, kind of tacking back to the center, coming across more of a centrist, more of that middle ground kind of a person that he had been when he was governor of Arkansas, and who at times he had been while running for president in 1992. So now Clinton had a chance to go forward in 1995 and 1996 with a new strategy, a new adversary, and a new advisor that he could, potentially change his political fortunes with. Republicans will attempt to enact the different items in the contract with America, but they're going to struggle to get all of these different measures over the top and actually become law. So they will have some successes. The idea of the line item veto is actually going to be something that they do make law. They're also going to have a provision that bans unfunded mandates. And what that is basically saying that the federal government can't mandate that states do things unless they provide them the money necessary to do those things. States had been complaining that the federal government was, had too many of these unfunded mandates, and that was something that they were trying to address in the contract. There was also something that said that if the federal government passes a law, the federal government must actually follow that law. There had been a previous, carve out that said that they didn't actually have to follow every, labor regulation, for example. Now, under this new provision, they would have to follow everything. So those were a couple of big victories, but there were a lot of other items in the contract with America that didn't pass. They weren't able to get the balanced budget amendment through. They weren't able to get term limits through. Just as a couple of examples. So a lot of the contract didn't end up becoming law, despite Gingrich's best efforts to try to make those things all come to fruition. So there would be big disputes between Gingrich and Clinton over spending, and this would cause a government shutdown. So these continual clashes will be big stories throughout 95 and 96. So far I've talked a lot about the change in the House with Newt Gingrich emerging as the big, powerful figure there. But the Senate also changed, and Republicans took control. And the person that would now control the Senate would be a gentleman named Bob Dole. He had been the minority leader before. Now, with the Republicans taking over the majority, he's going to become majority leader. Bob Dole had served in World War II and had been injured in combat, and he was first elected to the Senate in 1968, so he had been there for quite a while at this point. He became Gerald Ford's vice presidential running mate in the 1976 election, and he ran for president in 1980 and again in 1988. And in that 88 race, he would do quite well. He would, kind of come in second to George H.W. Bush that year. So he became minority leader in 1985, and at this point in 1996, he would be 73 years old. And many in 1994 and 1995 didn't think that he was going to run, or at least in the early part of 95, they didn't. They kind of figured that at 73, he was just too old and wouldn't want to do it. And the fact that he had just become majority leader and that had been such an important job, the conventional wisdom is that he would focus on that job and wouldn't want to do all the necessarily fundraising and all the other stuff necessary to become president. But as we start to get more towards the middle of the year, we start to see him doing some of the things that presidential candidates did, and it started to become more and more apparent that he was indeed going to run. And because he was such a powerful figure and he had been around so long and had had so much influence, and he had run for president and had a lot of connections across the country, he became a very formidable candidate. And once people realized that he was running, it kind of scared away a lot of these other potential candidates. So we'd start to see the likes of William Weld, Dan Quayle, John Angler, Tommy Thompson all decide that, after all, we're not going to run. And even Jack Kemp, who was thought to be the front runner, he ends up bowing out and deciding not to run. So Bob Dole becomes the front runner by the middle of 1995. Another person who did run was Phil Gramm, and I mentioned him earlier. I'll talk more about him now. He did not bow out when Bob Dole got in, but he continued full steam ahead. Phil Gramm had been a member of the Senate representing Texas, started his career as a Democrat in the House, but had been a Democrat that was an ally of Ronald Reagan. He worked with Ronald Reagan to get his bills passed, eventually converted and became a Republican, and then went on to win a seat in the Senate. So Phil Gramm was a member of some important committees, including the Banking Committee, which put him in a position where he could raise a lot of money for his campaign. So he was one of the most prolific fundraisers of this bunch and had some of the best finances of all these candidates, not including the ones that were self-financed. So Phil Gramm was probably a little bit more conservative than Bob Dole on both economics and social issues. So he, tried to run as a conservative alternative to the front runner, but not so conservative that he could be considered outside the mainstream. So he still, was in the Senate. He was kind of a mainstream kind of guy, but a very conservative member of that mainstream. So he had been something of a fiscal conservative as well. His focus was on economics. He had been an economics professor before he got into politics, and he had championed reducing the deficit. He was responsible for something called the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act, which was a mechanism by which spending could be controlled so the deficit wouldn't get out of hand. So that had been something of a reputation of his, and he helped to maybe appeal to maybe some Perot voters with that, but also just, like I said, a lot of Republicans who wanted a more conservative alternative to the front runner. Pat Buchanan had run in 1992, and he decided to give it another shot. He had done better than expected in the 1992 race and had raised his profile. And in the interim period, and even before that campaign, he was a TV personality. He was a co-host of a CNN show called Crossfire. And he had also, been on many shows like Meet the Press and other TV shows. So, certainly he was well known and very good on television, very well spoken. And, as we said in that earlier video, he was a very socially conservative individual. He was a devout Catholic. On foreign policy, though, he was a little bit more dovish and a little bit more protectionist when it came to trade policies. So he could very much distinguish himself from the other candidates. He had a little bit of a populist streak. And at this point, the Republicans very much had a reputation of being a more kind of business friendly party, so he kind of distinguished himself from that way. And he figured that if he did respectably enough against an incumbent president, maybe now that there wasn't an incumbent, maybe he might even have a better shot. So he makes another run, and it's certainly again running to the right of Bob Dole on most issues, but maybe not quite as mainstream as Phil Gramm, as Pat Buchanan was not an elected official. He had never been one. His closest spot to government was as a speechwriter and as an advisor to both Reagan and Nixon. Another candidate that would run would be Arlen Specter, who was a senator from Pennsylvania at this time. He was famous for a couple of different things. He had been the lawyer for the Warren Commission during the Kennedy assassination investigation. And in fact, if you ever watch that JFK movie by Oliver Stone, Kevin Costner's character actually makes a disparaging remark about Arlen Specter. It was something that kind of slipped under my radar the first time I saw the movie, but then I saw it a little bit later and heard that remark, and it kind of struck me. So Arlen Specter in this campaign, and the other thing he was famous for was during the Clarence Thomas hearings, he was on the committee questioning both Thomas and Anita Hill, who had accused Thomas of sexual harassment. And a lot of feminists disliked the way Specter questioned Anita Hill, thinking that he came after her too hard. But in this campaign, he would make a conscious decision, it looked like, to actually position himself as more of a moderate. There were all these other candidates trying to be the conservative candidate, trying to show themselves as conservative as possible for that Republican base. Specter decided that there was an open lane for somebody to run as maybe a moderate or a center-left kind of candidate, maybe appealing to a lot of those old Yankee Republicans, the Rockefeller Republicans that, were still there, although diminishing. So he, definitely positioned himself as a socially more liberal candidate, was for legal abortion and for some other, more moderate positions on some social issues. But I think that wing of the party at this time had become weaker and weaker, and the conservative side had just, started to become a different party. So when George H.W. Bush ran and he had that reputation as being from that moderate wing, there was enough of those left that he was able to be successful. But I think by this point, I think Arlen Specter trying to take on that mantle, it just wasn't going to be successful. He wouldn't end up lasting to the Iowa caucus. He would drop out before that because he wasn't able to garner enough support. Another candidate running was Richard Lugar, senator from Indiana. And as you can tell from this picture, a very distinguished looking gentleman. He, quote unquote, looked the presidential part, with his salt and pepper kind of hair. But he was something of a policy wonk as well, was somebody who had some expertise in foreign policy and on agriculture policy, as he was a prominent member of different committees in the Senate. So moderate to conservative, certainly well liked in middle America where he was from, as representing Indiana, the Corn Belt. Maybe his one weakness, though, was charisma. He was not exactly the most fiery speaker. So, he came across as somewhat bland in a television age. Maybe, voters were looking for somebody who was a little bit more well-spoken, a little bit more, with a little bit better oratory skills. And I think that might have been why he never really caught fire. And speaking of fire, we also had Bob Dornan in the race. Bob Dornan had been a member of the House, a representative from California. And just to show you how different, politics was at this time. Dornan represented California. It was Orange County, which is kind of like in between Los Angeles and San Diego. But he was considered very conservative indeed. Quite right wing. Certainly rivaled Pat Buchanan with his conservatism on social issues, and was also conservative on economic issues. And he sort of became famous for some of his House speeches, a very bombastic sort of tone that he would take. And a lot of his speeches would condemn Bill Clinton, and he certainly went after Clinton on some of his scandals and some of his, some of the ethics issues that had come into question. Now, a lot of people thought that Dornan would kind of, take aim at his fellow Republicans in this race and in the debates, that he might, throw up some of that fire at them the way he had Bill Clinton. But, I think surprisingly to me, at least, and maybe to others, he really took a different tone. When he entered the race and entered some of these debates, he came off as a little bit more avuncular. He, toned things down quite a bit and was, a lot more mellow. And he spent a lot of the debates complimenting his fellow Republicans. He said nice things about Bob Dole, about Phil Gramm, about Pat Buchanan. So, Dornan, didn't, light the house on fire really. And I think, he was in a wing where he was kind of sharing the spotlight with Pat Buchanan, who I think had just gotten a head start on him and had, a little bit more name recognition. So Dornan was never really able to catch on, but it was an interesting kind of footnote in this race. He would end up losing his House seat a little bit later on that year to Loretta Sanchez in a very close race. So a lot of people say that maybe his campaigning around the country for president might have actually hurt his career and caused him to lose in the House. Alan Keyes was a lesser-known candidate. He had been an ambassador and had run for senator unsuccessfully in Maryland. And he really took on a lot of social conservative causes. Morality was a big part of his campaign. At one point, he acknowledged that he really wasn't running to win, but was running to kind of raise issues. And particularly the morality issue was one that really was something that he was trying to push hard for and advocate for. So very much a member of what I call the Christian right, and was very well spoken, very articulate. And I think he was able to generate at least a cult following because he had such a well-spoken way about him in advocating for positions that a lot of conservatives held. Lamar Alexander was another candidate that was running in this election, and probably one of the lesser known ones. He had been Secretary of Education, which, as I said earlier, was kind of a lesser known, lower level cabinet post at that time. And he had also been governor of Tennessee, which was a kind of small to medium sized state. And he really made states' rights an important part of his campaign. States' rights had become more popular amongst the Republicans at this time. Certain items in the contract with America dealt with states' rights. So he really took on that mantle. And he profiled maybe slightly more moderate than Dole, but conservative enough to be acceptable to the more hardcore conservative base of the Republican Party. So on the states' rights issue, he maybe came off as a little bit more conservative, and he bumped heads a little bit with Phil Gramm in one of the debates about Gramm wanting to have a national policy on something. I forget what it was, but Lamar Alexander saying it should be left up to the states. So he also was kind of famous for wearing plaid in this campaign, kind of trying to take on a little bit of a different stylistic choice. So, it was certainly something that he tried to, make it unique about his persona. Another candidate was Pete Wilson. He had been governor of California, and anytime you have a governor of such a big state with such a large economy, you have to consider that person as a potential presidential candidate. I would say Pete Wilson was somewhat more moderate on social issues. He was for legal abortion, but unlike Arlen Specter, he really didn't focus on that. In fact, if anything, he was trying to focus on his tough policies on immigration. So that was something that a lot of conservatives had become concerned about. Now, Pat Buchanan had also raised that issue a lot as well, but Pete Wilson was able to say, as governor of California, he was starting to do some stuff about it. He had championed an idea called Proposition 187, which would crack down on illegal immigration. He had also won re-election in 1994 with a pretty healthy margin against Jerry Brown's sister, Kathleen Brown. So he had some things going for him, but he had a couple of things that didn't go so well for him. I think a lot of times when candidates run, they're criticized for maybe not paying enough attention to their day job, whether it be senators missing votes or governors being out of town during important things going on in the state. They're out all over the country running for president. But when you have a big state like California and you're taking time off to kind of go campaign for president, I think that that's going to become a larger issue than it might be for normal circumstances. So he was criticized a lot for that. And then there was the timing of his decision to run. There had already been a lot of candidates who had announced, and it was starting to become like almost a fatigue where, there were too many candidates in there and voters were still trying to wrap their heads around all these candidates. And then he came out somewhat later after so much attention had been paid and there were so many other candidates making their announcements. So he kind of slipped under the radar screen and didn't get that sort of big announcement bounce that other candidates did. So, he would end up struggling and he would drop out soon, just a couple months into his campaign, wouldn't make it to the Iowa caucuses. Another person who ran is Steve Forbes. And again, I think Steve Forbes, he waited a little bit longer, and by doing so, it actually benefited him. So he waited until the other candidates had been in the race a while, had gotten their share of media scrutiny, had had some debates where they went after each other. And I think after a certain period of time, voters start thinking to themselves, oh, gee, I sure wish there was somebody else in that race. And then if you enter, you can do well. And I think with Pete Wilson, he didn't enter late enough for that to happen, but Steve Forbes entered a little bit later, and he did benefit from that. So who was Steve Forbes? He was the magazine publisher of Forbes magazine and a wealthy individual. And, certainly people in the finance and business community were familiar with his magazine. And he was a non-apologetic supply sider. He definitely, favored business-friendly, government policies. His big cause was the flat tax, where he wanted to eliminate the different tax brackets, where instead of having the wealthier pay more and be in higher brackets, everybody would pay the same percentage of tax. And he wanted to get rid of all the different deductions for being, if you would have been able to get deductions for doing certain things with your money. He wanted to get rid of all of that and have everybody just pay one standard flat tax, across the board on their income. So he was a little bit quirky, had a very unconventional speaking style, but I think he was able to tap into something. I think that certainly amongst more economic conservative people that he was appealing to them. And because he was such a wealthy individual, he self-financed, much as Ross Perot had done in 1992, and Steve Forbes would self-finance. And there was no limit really to how much money he could spend because he had so much of it. So that gave him something of an advantage that some of the other candidates didn't have. Now, in this particular race, he wouldn't focus so much on social issues. He was a social conservative, but that wasn't his focus. When he ran in 2000, he would try to focus on that more. But here in 1996, he really didn't champion those causes. So he wasn't going after the same voters that Pat Buchanan and Dornan and Alan Keyes were going after. He was more, looking at some of the, the more economically conservative individuals and the members of the business community. So I have this chart here just to kind of map out what I mean here with some of these different lanes. So kind of Bob Dole was certainly the front runner, and I kind of put him in the middle. So he was a conservative and had been on the right. Was kind of like a bridge between that sort of paleo-conservative movement from the mid 20th century and the more neoconservative movement that would come a little bit later. He was, from, very much middle America, a farming community. He was from Kansas. So, he kind of had that kind of small town American values, a World War II veteran. And, I think that the reason why he was the front runner is because I think he could be acceptable to the different factions of the party. I think socially conservative individuals could feel like he was with them enough on the issues, and economic conservative, same thing. And, so with Lamar Alexander, like I said, not too far from Dole on the issues, maybe a little bit more moderate on some things, but definitely more of a states' rights advocate. Pete Wilson, a little bit more liberal on social issues, but he did have some conservative issues that he championed, like immigration. And Arlen Specter, I think, at least in this campaign, tried to, really run as maybe the most moderate, the most furthest left of the different candidates. And then Richard Lugar, I think, kind of similar to Dole, maybe a little bit more conservative on some things, particularly with spending, and then Phil Gramm would be a little bit more conservative, but more of a mainline conservative, with a focus on economics and whereas Pat Buchanan was, I think, more focused on social issues, and Pat Buchanan differentiating himself with more dovish foreign policy and more more protectionist trade views, whereas Bob Dornan was kind of similar to Buchanan, a very socially conservative individual, but I don't think Dornan was the as dovish as Buchanan was. Dornan actually was a little bit more hawkish. Steve Forbes, of course, was, positioning himself on the right economically, perhaps even further right than Phil Gramm. I think that they were kind of trying to appeal to some of the same voters. And then we have Alan Keyes, I think, who was, even more focused on social issues than any of the other candidates. And, kind of that's how I think that they would kind of map out. So Louisiana would move its caucus to February 6th, but by doing so, they were in violation of the RNC rules. And because of that, a lot of the candidates chose not to campaign in Louisiana out of respect for Iowa, which had traditionally been the first caucus state. So Phil Gramm did make a play for it. He, being from the neighboring state of Texas, he thought that he might have had the best shot. And Pat Buchanan would also make a play for it. And Buchanan would be socially conservative, and so were a lot of Louisiana voters. In fact, the governor of Louisiana would endorse Buchanan. And what happens is Pat Buchanan ends up winning the Louisiana caucus, seen as quite a bit of an upset, as Phil Gramm was seen to have been favored. He certainly had the money and the finances and the infrastructure and the organization. He had aside from the governor, he kind of had the establishment behind him. But it would be Buchanan who would win and get 15 out of the 21 delegates. When Bob Dole had run in 1988, he won the Iowa caucus, which was what made him a sort of first-tier candidate. And he wins here again in the Iowa caucus, but not by much. It ends up being a lot closer than what people thought. People thought that Dole, now being a more front runner and having that front runner status, that he would run away with it. But he only beats Buchanan by 3 points, and Pat Buchanan ends up with a very respectable showing. And then Lamar Alexander also has a fairly respectable showing in third place with 17.5%. The others kind of underperformed, and particularly Phil Gramm. After Phil Gramm had made a play for Louisiana and been unsuccessful, he thought that with his money, his organization, and his conservative views that he would play well with Iowa caucus voters, but he would only get 9% and would be in fifth place. And that kind of spelled the end of his campaign, as he didn't think that what he was doing was clicking with enough voters. So Phil Gramm drops out between Iowa and New Hampshire. So we have now the New Hampshire primary on February 20th. And New Hampshire had been a state where Pat Buchanan performed rather well against George H.W. Bush. And we see him performing well yet again. In fact, he wins the New Hampshire primary narrowly, and gets a lot of a boost, a lot of momentum, and a lot of attention for doing so, beating Bob Dole. Now, interestingly enough, the percentage he gets here, 27%, was actually smaller than the percentage he got in 1992. But with so many different candidates in the race, 27% was all he needed. And again, we see Lamar Alexander putting up a respectable showing with 22%. So he's trying to use this as an argument that he's got enough strength that voters should give him another look. And at one point he says that it's now a two-way race between him and Pat Buchanan, trying to convince those more moderate voters, those more centrist, more mainstream voters that may be fearful of Pat Buchanan maybe not being electable enough, that they should ditch Dole and support him instead. So he'd make that play in the states moving forward. But we'd see these other candidates, Forbes, Lugar, and Keyes, while not placing too well in Iowa or New Hampshire, they're going to stay in the race nonetheless and try to win in some of those later contests. And less than a week after New Hampshire would be Delaware. And just goes to show you that momentum isn't everything. I think a lot of people, when they study primaries, they feel like if a person can get ahead in some of these early states, that momentum can catapult them. But if they do poorly, then it will bury them. Now here we have Steve Forbes, who kind of underperformed in both Iowa and New Hampshire, but here he does well in Delaware. And I think what happened there was you had the other candidates focusing on Iowa and New Hampshire. Delaware came less than a week after New Hampshire, but Forbes was the only one really kind of focusing on it, really making an effort there, running ads there. He kind of had the state to himself to a large extent, and he would end up winning the state outright, beating Dole by 6 points. And we see Pat Buchanan not really doing as well, Lamar Alexander not doing as well either, because neither of them had been focusing on Delaware. They kind of, took it for granted. Then on February 27th, we have contests in Arizona and the Dakotas. The Dakotas are both kind of small farm states in the prairies, and Bob Dole kind of had an edge there, and we would see him winning both South Dakota and North Dakota rather handedly. In the case of South Dakota, we see Pat Buchanan coming in second. In the case of North Dakota, we have Steve Forbes coming in second. But the real contest was in Arizona, where Pat Buchanan really made a play for it and thought that he had a good shot with his focus on illegal immigration, which was affecting that state disproportionately. But there was a photo op that didn't suit him and didn't help his campaign. He kind of went to the OK Corral and kind of dressed up as a cowboy and was walking around the OK Corral with a kind of holster and a gun, kind of acting a little cartoonish. And it kind of came off as kind of unpresidential or non-presidential. And I think that really kind of hurt him, moving into that primary. He had already had that sort of mark as, people saying that he wasn't electable, he wasn't presidential, he was not, some said he wasn't a mainstream candidate. And by him kind of having that photo op, I think it kind of reinforced a lot of concerns that a lot of voters had. At one point, it was announced that he had gotten second in Arizona when the results were coming in, but indeed he came in third. But Steve Forbes would be the one who wins in Arizona. And after coming off a win in Delaware, now winning Arizona, he does now seem to have a little bit of a momentum, going for him. But Bob Dole comes in second, and by also winning in the Dakotas, Bob Dole is kind of reestablishing himself. And we see Lamar Alexander now, struggling in all of these states, kind of coming in fourth in all three. So his campaign is starting to lose a little bit of steam. Then on March 2nd, we had South Carolina, and Alexander, being a Southerner, thought that maybe he might have a shot to do well there. Buchanan, being socially conservative, he had done well in Louisiana. South Carolina, kind of a somewhat similar profile, although not as many Catholics as Louisiana has. But nonetheless, Buchanan made a play for it. He thought he might have a shot, but really neither performed all that well. Bob Dole would win the state, and he'd win it pretty convincingly by double digits, 45%, and Buchanan got 29%. Forbes would get 13%, and actually Alexander would kind of languish in fourth place with only 10%. Super Tuesday would occur on March 5th, and 9 states would hold contests, and Bob Dole will win them all. He kind of does a sweep with all 9 states, making him the de facto nominee. Now, interestingly enough, Jack Kemp would reemerge around this time and actually endorse his fellow supply-sider Steve Forbes. The only problem is, by this point, with all these primaries being won by Dole, it might have been a little bit too little too late, but nonetheless, Forbes decides to soldier on and try to win some later contests. But I think it did seem like Bob Dole, would have a definite advantage as he's, sweeping across all these different states. Now, there would be a contest in Missouri on March 9th that Pat Buchanan would win. But aside from that, the primary was essentially over by this point. So Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton are going to continue to bump heads throughout 1995 and 1996. Gingrich is going to propose some measures that will reform welfare in a manner that will shorten the amount of time people are allowed to stay on public assistance. Now, this was something that Bill Clinton had said he supported in the past and was still generally behind, although a lot of liberals were skeptical of the idea. But he opposed Gingrich on the details, and he said that Gingrich's proposal was too draconian, and he wanted to have a more moderate welfare reform measure. On the budget, Gingrich wanted to reduce the deficit as soon as possible, and he made some proposals that would reduce entitlement spending, particularly on Medicare. And Bill Clinton used that as a campaign and political issue, talking about how cutting Medicare too much was certainly not something that he supported, even if he broadly liked the idea of a balanced budget. So they bumped heads on a lot of these issues, but eventually they would reach a compromise, and Bill Clinton would sign a law that would reform welfare and that would balance the budget. So after they had fought on it for so long, Bill Clinton finally embraces it, and under sort of Dick Morris's tutelage and his sort of advice, Bill Clinton then, took credit for these issues, and he declared in one of his State of the Union speeches, the era of big government is over. So now he's sort of taking the mantle of the person who, made these big reforms and, reduced the influence of government, which definitely appealed a lot to middle America. And because Bill Clinton was such a good salesman, he was able to convince enough people that he should be credited for that, even though it was something that Gingrich was really pushing and that Bill Clinton had fought him a bit on, but eventually they reached the compromise and Clinton was able to co-opt the issue. So we're going to see the economy continue to improve. And one of the things about economics, I think people tend to notice when it's bad more than they notice when it's good. And after a period of a really harsh economic period, if it starts to get a little bit better, it doesn't necessarily feel that good. People are still kind of feeling the hurt. And I think what happened was, yes, the economy was pretty bad in 1992. The unemployment rate would be around 7.5% if we took average of the different months throughout the year. In 93, we saw a slight improvement. It's now like 6.9%, but people are still kind of feeling like the economy is not too good. And with 94, it kind of depends. Some parts of the country it improved a lot, some not so much. We see the unemployment rate reducing to 6.1%. But then as we start to get to 95, 96, it starts to improve enough over a long enough period of time that people really start to feel it. So at unemployment rates like 5.6%, 5.4%, it's now definitely a big improvement from what it had been. And I think American people are now starting to see that the economy definitely is getting better, and they can see real world examples around them. And this is largely credited at the time the internet was starting to become a booming thing. More and more people were buying computers. More and more people were doing things online, and there was something called the dot-com boom. And so we would see an improved economy during this time. And because the economy was getting better and there were less people on unemployment, it made balancing the budget easier because they didn't need to spend as much on social safety net programs, and you had more people paying taxes as more people are working, and as they start to get paid more, they start to pay more in taxes. So we started to see more money coming into the government, less going out, which definitely made it easier to balance the budget without having to do as much draconian measures. And we start to see Bill Clinton's approval rating improve along with the economy. Now, I've never been one for approving of the president simply because the economy is doing well or disapproving simply because the economy is bad. I think people should look at the bigger picture. Nevertheless, there is often a correlation between the two things. Although, as we see throughout these different periods where these polls were taken, it did go kind of up and down. Okay, in the beginning here, we saw in June, he was at 37%, which was pretty bad, June of 93. Then we see an improvement in September of 93, March of 94 is actually even more of an improvement. Then it dropped a little bit in June of 94. But as we start getting towards the end, as we start getting towards the middle of 96, we start to see him consistently above 50%. And that's really a good place to be if you're a president running for re-election, especially if you're above 55%, which he started to be. So that's, putting him in pretty good shape, to, potentially win re-election. If you're an incumbent and you've got more than 55% of the voters that approve of you, then that's going to probably bode well for your re-election effort. Now to the question of Bob Dole's running mate. The first picture there, we see Carroll Campbell, who had been governor of South Carolina, a younger individual. And for those who might have been concerned about Bob Dole's age, they might have been happy to have had a younger person there, a sort of more energetic, vibrant, well-spoken individual, which Carroll Campbell was. And I would say of all four of these gentlemen, I think that Carroll Campbell was the most kind of a Bob Dole kind of guy. He had endorsed him and helped him win that South Carolina primary. You may recall that Dole had won that primary pretty convincingly, and that kind of brought him the momentum needed to kind of close the deal on the primary campaign. I think that the reason why maybe he ultimately didn't pick him is that he saw that at this point Bob Dole was something of the underdog now. He was kind of behind Bill Clinton, and he felt like he needed to have more of a splash with the person that he'd pick, and maybe he felt like Carol Campbell wasn't enough of a household name, that it wouldn't bring the kind of spark that maybe he needed in his campaign. So he ended up not going with him. William Bennett is pictured here. Now, Bennett said that Bob Dole did offer him the vice presidential spot, and that Bennett turned it down and suggested he pick Jack Kemp instead. I have a little bit of a hard time believing that. I think that Bennett would have been a strange choice because he had never had any elected office. He had been Secretary of Education, which, as we said, was kind of a lower level cabinet post at that time. He had been drug czar, and he had written a book called The Book of Virtues, and might have written a few other things, but he was considered something of a socially conservative advocate for those issues. So he might have appealed to Alan Keyes voters, I suppose, maybe a little bit of the Pat Buchanan voters, but I'm not so sure that he would have been a great choice, or that he would have, brought any kind of great constituency to Bob Dole that he otherwise wouldn't have had. So I found it a little bit odd that he would have gotten the offer, but different people have a different definition of what offer meant. Maybe he did call him, maybe he did talk to him about it. Maybe it would have created a little bit more of a splash, maybe more so with Carol Campbell, but not much more. The other person that was considered was John McCain, and as we said earlier, John McCain had endorsed Phil Gramm in the primary, so might have seemed like strange to pick a guy that had endorsed another candidate. But again, maybe Bob Dole was looking to generate a little bit of a buzz, and McCain was certainly somebody who was very media friendly even at this point in time, and was pretty well respected. He had been a veteran like Dole, but he ended up picking Jack Kemp, and I think that of all four of these people, I think Jack Kemp would have created more of a buzz, more of a spark to the campaign. So that's exactly what happened. He picked him, and Jack Kemp certainly did bring some energy, and he had a way of appealing to moderate voters, which we talked about before. Maybe the one flaw or the one drawback is often the vice president is seen as the kind of attack dog. Is if they do a sort of good cop, bad cop, the running mate is often the bad cop who kind of does more of the negative campaigning. And that wasn't really Jack Kemp's style. He was more of a warm and fuzzy, a sort of glass half full kind of guy. So he wasn't going to be one that would do the attack dog stuff. And so, a lot of Republicans kind of lamented that choice. Maybe they kind of would have liked a little bit more of a hard-nosed person, but certainly he did have a way of appealing to middle of the road kind of voters, and so he might have been the best possible choice. So what was Ross Perot up to throughout all of this? So we talked about Perot a lot in the 1992 video. Haven't talked about him much yet, but Perot would remain somewhat visible after the 1992 election and his relatively strong showing. He'd participate on a debate on CNN with Al Gore during the NAFTA debate, and Perot took the anti-NAFTA position, with Al Gore taking the pro-NAFTA position. It was thought, though, that Perot maybe underperformed a little bit and didn't make his case effectively to the American people during that debate. The other thing that kind of was going on, and we saw that in 1993, Clinton had proposed his budget, which would have done some of the things Perot called for, like the gas tax and the deficit reduction. But Perot, rather than taking credit for the fact that the Democrats were co-opting him, he instead kind of played more of an armchair quarterback kind of role, or a backseat driver, and he ridiculed the details of their proposals, even as they were kind of capitulating to a lot of the ideas that he had brought forth. So there was that. And he had endorsed a whole series of different candidates for both Democrats and Republicans leading up to the 1994 election. And in some cases, his endorsed candidates won. In some cases, they didn't. But he kind of kept his name out there. And what he would eventually do is form his own party. He would form something called the Reform Party. and this would differentiate what happened in 1992, where he ran as an independent. Now he's going to try to create a party apparatus around his movement. So as Perot was forming this party, he was non-committal about whether or not he would run again. He kind of painted it as, I want to build something that's bigger than myself, that's going to outlast me. So that's what he seemed to be doing with this Reform Party, and he kind of left it open. If anybody wanted to run to be president under the Reform Party banner, they would get his support and the sort of apparatus behind it. And it could be disgruntled Democrats or disgruntled Republicans. Well, would end up being a person that would seek that Reform Party nomination, and it would be a gentleman named Bill Lamb, who had been governor of Colorado. He had run for the Senate and had lost in the primary to Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who we talked about. Campbell had won the race. First, he won the primary against Lamb and then won the general election. But then promptly 2 years later, he became a Republican. So Lamb was kind of left without an office. So he's now kind of seeking the Reform Party banner and thinking that perhaps he has a shot at winning the presidency under that. But then lo and behold, Perot is going to announce that he is going to run after all. So the way the Reform Party is going to pick their nominee is through the convention system. So both Lamb and Perot are going to go and kind of seek the delegates needed to win in that convention and end up being the Reform Party nominee. Lamb was a credible candidate, so Perot would end up winning, but by having Lamb there, sometimes he was referred to as the sacrificial lamb. Perot was able to say that there was a viable candidate that Perot was able to beat to get the nomination, and perhaps he thought that that would bolster him. The Libertarians would pick Harry Browne as their nominee. And Harry Browne, I don't think on the issues was all too different from Andre Marou. Harry Browne would have very fiscally conservative ideas, a strict constructionalist on the Constitution, but more socially liberal policies. I think maybe the difference is Harry Browne was a little bit more of a polished kind of speaker, and I think he had a talk radio background, if I'm not mistaken. He certainly talked like somebody who did, very, very articulate, very well spoken, and maybe somebody that could have had a broader appeal, despite the fact that he had not had an elected office, which Andre Marou had. But on the issues, they were fairly similar, and so he would take on that Libertarian Party banner. The Democrats would have a very festive convention. One of the things that had been very popular at this time in the summer of '96 was something called the Macarena. It had been a dance and a song that had been something of a craze. So throughout the Democratic convention in '96, we saw the different delegates doing the Macarena, kind of doing these different dances and stuff. So that was one of the big takeaways, the big visual. And Bill Clinton then gave his speech, and he declared that he was going to build a bridge to the 21st century. So, there was a couple of things you can interpret that with. Whoever wins this race would be the first president in the 21st century. But also, it was a little bit of a subtle jab at Bob Dole, who had been a little bit older. And I think Clinton was making the case of, do you really want somebody who is as old as Bob Dole to be that first president of the 21st century, or do you want somebody younger? So at the Republican convention, Dole will announce that he will drop out of the Senate and basically focus entirely on his presidential campaign. Remember, Dole had been the majority leader, which was a very important and powerful position, and one that people thought that was kind of his dream job, but he said he would give it up and instead focus on winning the presidency as his full-time job. In my 1992 video, I did a breakdown of the issues and where the different candidates stood on that. I'm not going to do that this time because I really feel like there wasn't a huge change from 1992 to 96. In fact, two of the candidates are going to be the same. We have Ross Perot and Bill Clinton back again. They had both run in 92 and are now running in 96. They're not really they haven't really changed too much on their positions. We have Clinton. We talked about how he had a bit of an evolution from his early presidency now to this later part of his presidency. Maybe he's seen more now as a bit of more of a deficit hawk than he had been before, but he's largely the same person. Same thing with Ross Perot, more or less. And we see Harry Browne there. Harry Browne wasn't all that different from Andre Moreau. Then we have Bob Dole. And there wasn't huge differences either between George H.W. Bush and Bob Dole. Both were seen as kind of center-right candidates. I think maybe, if anything, Bob Dole might have been slightly more conservative. At least conservatives were a little bit more comfortable with him. He hadn't had the earlier point of Bush's career. He had been more of a liberal Republican, and Bob Dole didn't have that kind of baggage as some of the conservatives might have seen it as. So, there was that, and I think Bob Dole was a little bit less of an internationalist. So, for example, he made a speech where he criticized the idea of having Boutros Ghali in charge of the American military. Now, Boutros had been the chairman of the UN Security Council and somebody who had been a Bush ally. So for Dole to be kind of critical of Ghali, I think was kind of differentiating himself a little bit, maybe taking on a little bit more of a paleo-conservative idea of a more of a more cautious foreign policy. And I think Dole probably was a little bit more dovish, maybe a little bit more cautious about how to use the military than maybe what Bush had been. So, there would be that little bit of a difference. Maybe Dole had historically been a little bit more of a deficit hawk. Maybe there was that difference as well. But otherwise, I think that his policy positions were pretty close to Bush's. And like I said, the others were pretty close to their counterparts or themselves in 1992. And we'd see another party emerge that hadn't been a factor in 1992, and that would be the Green Party. And Ralph Nader would end up being the nominee. Ralph Nader was a fairly well-known individual who was seen as a progressive. He had been a consumer advocate and certainly a critic of big business. So the Green Party is going to be very much a progressive left party, originally focused mostly on the environment. And Nader wasn't necessarily a staunch environmentalist, like that wasn't his brand, but he was something of an environmentalist, and at least from the same part of the political spectrum as the Green Party. So it seemed to be an okay fit. So he ended up being the nominee. He wouldn't end up running as a prominent as a campaign as he would 4 years later in 2000, but he would be on the ballot in many states during 1996. So we have election day, and let's look at the results. And I thought it might be interesting to look at the 1992 results on top of the 1996 results, starting with the raw popular vote. Now, the voter turnout would decrease. In 1992, there was 104 million people that voted. In 1996, there would be 96 million. So we see a voter turnout drop of 8 million from 1992 to 1996. But that drop does not show in either Clinton's numbers. Clinton's numbers go up, and then Dole's numbers actually do go up a little bit from what Bush's numbers had been, but not by much. Bush had gotten 39,104,000, whereas Dole got 39,198,000. So a little bit of an improvement there from Dole to Bush, and a bigger improvement by Clinton as his vote total goes up by about 2.5 million. So the big drop off would be Ross Perot. So he had gotten 19,743,821 votes in 1992, and we're going to see that drop by more than half as he's now got 8,085,402 in 1996. So that's going to be the big difference. Perot's showing is just not going to be as strong. And there's probably a number of reasons for that. One, the fact that a lot of his issues got co-opted by the other candidates. It kind of gave him less of a purpose. And I think the bad economy had given him a lot of purpose in 1992, and now the economy was a lot better. And I think that maybe his behavior, his lack of grace when they were starting to embrace his ideas, and maybe the way in which he had, won the Reform Party nomination with all that stuff with Bill Lamb. A lot of that might have ended up hurting Perot's campaign. So he does not, show nearly as well. He was not part of the debates, which I think also made a big difference on the results as well. So so it was that 11 million or so, 11.5 million that voted for Perot in 1992 that did not vote in 1996 that I think accounts for a good amount of that drop in voter turnout. But we also might have seen some of those folks going to vote for Harry Browne, as we see Harry Browne actually improving quite a bit from Andre Moreau's numbers. Andre Moreau had gotten about 290,000. Harry Browne's now getting 485,000, and Browne at about 0.5%. And then we see Ralph Nader there. Maybe some of those old Perot voters went with Nader as well. But, a point I had made in the 1992 video when Perot had dropped out briefly and Clinton's numbers shot up, I said, with Perot out of the race, Clinton does better. And I think now we see in 1996 reinforcing that idea. Perot's in the race, but in a much diminished capacity, and Clinton definitely benefited from that. So we see in the percentages, Clinton had about a 5.5% win over Bush in 1992. So here in 1996, we see him getting about a 6.5%, differential. So his percent differential definitely improves. I'm sorry, did I say 6.5? I meant, well, my math is bad. 8.5%. So a much bigger differential from 1992 to 1996. Clinton's winning margin. So that was the popular vote. Now let's take a look at the electoral vote. So in the Electoral College, we see the 1992 map next to the 1996 map, and they're pretty similar to each other. Most of the states went the same way, in both elections. But I think it is worth pointing out some of the few changes that there were. We see Florida changing. Bush had carried it in 1992, and now we see Clinton carrying it in 1996. And you might look at that and think that that's kind of strange at first. We see a lot of seniors in Florida. You would think Bob Dole might have been the one to appeal to those seniors. But I think the Medicare issue was a very prominent issue in the mid-90s, and Gingrich's proposals to kind of cut Medicare that Clinton really capitalized on. And Dole had kind of gone along with Gingrich on that. And I think that hurt the Republican brand with a lot of those seniors. So we see Clinton edging out Dole in Florida, whereas in 1992 he had lost it by a pretty small margin. So not a big margin in either year, but now we see Clinton carrying it. Now Georgia, on the other hand, flipped the other way. So Clinton had carried it in 1992, but we see Dole carrying it in 1996. And I think maybe that's part of that broader kind of trend where we see the South kind of shifting away from the Democrats and to the Republicans more solidly. And, I think that if we looked at the margins in some of these other states, we might see that as well. I think Louisiana was narrower Clinton win, whereas Texas, which was narrower in 1992 with Bush winning it, I think we've seen Dole winning it by a little bit more. So I think we're seeing the South kind of shifting a little bit more Republican this year. So the other states that changed include Colorado. So we see Dole now carrying Colorado, whereas Clinton had carried it in 1992. Montana, another Western state, Clinton had carried in 92. Now we see Dole carrying it in 96. And I'm not really sure why that is. Maybe in some of these Western mountain states, maybe Perot's voters in those states might have been more inclined to go with Dole than they were for Clinton. So that might have been an exception to the rule that I stated earlier. Maybe there was something more to it than that. I'm not sure. But we do see with Arizona, Clinton does carry it in 1996, whereas Bush had carried it in 1992. So that flipped towards Clinton. So what it looks like, 25 of the electoral votes from Florida flipped towards Clinton, 8 electoral votes from Arizona flipped towards Clinton, whereas the states that voted that had flipped away from Clinton towards Dole, 13 electoral votes for Georgia, and then 8 for Colorado and 3 for Montana. So Clinton's electoral vote does improve a little bit from his 1992 numbers, although there's states that flipped in both directions. But the overwhelming majority of the states kind of stayed the same. So now with the elections over, let's talk a little bit about the aftermath. So we're going to see a continuation of the theme that I talked about earlier with the South and the prairie states becoming more and more solidly Republican. And I think in the next few elections in the early 21st century, we're going to see that solidify with the Republicans really sweeping those states. But on the other hand, the Northeast is going to kind of flip the other way. We're going to see the Northeast starting to get more and more solidly Democratic. So, and the West Coast as well is going to be more solidly Democratic. And we're going to see that in both presidential elections and in congressional elections as well. Now, with the economy that's going to continue to be strong as we move into the late 90s, powered by the dot-com era with the computers and the internet starting to become a much more bigger part of the economy. So we're going to see the deficit eliminated in the late 90s. So that's going to be one of the rare times in the last sort of century or so where we're going to see a balanced budget. Was going to be in this couple of these years in the late 90s. We're going to actually see no deficit. In the 21st century, the deficit unfortunately is going to return, and it's going to continue on, and we're going to continue to have high deficits from from 2001 and onwards. So tensions between Gingrich and Clinton are going to continue to fester in Clinton's second term. Clinton is going to end up being impeached for misleading a grand jury about an affair he had with intern Monica Lewinsky. So that's going to be a big factor in the politics moving forward. The Reform Party is going to be around. It's going to be a force for a brief period. A gentleman named Jesse Ventura is going to be elected governor of Minnesota under the Reform Party. Ventura, a very charismatic figure, but he's not going to get along too well with Ross Perot, and he's going to end up leaving the party, and the party is going to end up diminishing by the early 2000s. So that's that for the 1996 election. So I want to thank everybody for sticking with me, and be sure to give it a like and a share.